He didn't scream when they cut off his jewels, he just made sure to remember their faces. Welcome to Brutal History for Sleep, where bedtime stories end in betrayal. If this gently cursed little channel helps you drift off to the sound of historical sabotage, consider liking, subscribing, or leaving a comment. Let us know where in the world you're watching from and what hour murder usually crosses your mind. Tonight's episode follows a boy who was cut to serve and rose to rule. He didn't just survive the blade, he memorized every name, pulled every string, and made sure no emperor ever forgot who really held the pen. Close your eyes. The fire crackles. My voice is the only thing left moving. You're warm now, buried under weightless sheets, surrounded by stillness that listens. Your breath slows. Nothing aches, not yet. There, the scent of incense and damp stone. Red lacquer doors gleam under torchlight. A scroll slides across a silk-draped table. A name is written, a life is ended, and the man who signs it? He wears white. He bows low, and he remembers. In the heaving golden palaces of the Tang Dynasty, where jade ornaments clinked softly in the breeze, and silk curtains whispered secrets to anyone who'd listen, young boys were led through corridors that grew progressively darker with each step. They weren't heading to lessons in calligraphy or philosophy. No, these children were about to undergo a transformation so complete, so irreversible, that it would echo through Chinese history for 2,000 years. The destination was a room that smelled distinctly less pleasant than the perfumed halls outside, a curious mixture of copper, herbs, and what could only be described as institutional despair. The procedure itself was performed with all the medical sophistication of a blacksmith reshaping a particularly stubborn piece of metal. The specialist, and yes, there were specialists, men who'd inherited this delightful profession from their fathers like a family recipe for dumplings, would examine the boy with the detached professionalism of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before, which he probably had. The going rate for castration was surprisingly reasonable, especially when you considered that you were purchasing a ticket to the highest levels of imperial power. Or death. But mostly, power. The boys, typically between 7 and 10 years old, were volunteers in the same way that conscripts volunteer for war. Technically true, but missing some important context. Their families, faced with the crushing poverty that characterized life for most Han Dynasty peasants, had made a calculation. They could keep their son intact and watch him grow up to inherit the family's nothing, or they could offer him to the knife and potentially watch him rise to command armies, topple ministers, and whisper poison into imperial ears. For many families, it wasn't really a choice at all. The actual procedure took place on a specially designed chair that looked like a birthing stool had mated with a torture device and produced something uniquely horrible. The boy would be held down, gently but firmly, because customer service still mattered even in the genital removal business, while the specialist applied a numbing concoction. This anesthetic was made from a secret blend of herbs that probably included opium, definitely included alcohol, and might have included whatever else was lying around the medicine cabinet that day. The effectiveness varied wildly. Some boys felt nothing. Others felt everything. The screams, reportedly, could be heard 3 courtyards away, which is why the castration chambers were usually located in the palace's acoustic dead zones. The knife itself was a marvel of specialized engineering. Curved like a sickle, but sharp as a calligrapher's wit, it was designed to remove everything in one swift motion. And when they say everything, they meant everything. Penis, testicles, the whole biological department of reproduction, gone in less time than it takes to brew a cup of tea. The Chinese approach to castration was thorough in a way that would have made their Byzantine counterparts jealous. Why leave anything to chance when you could leave nothing at all? Immediately after the cut, a metal plug, usually bronze or pewter, depending on the family's budget, was inserted into the new opening to prevent it from closing. This plug would need to be worn for the rest of the eunuch's life, removed only for urination, which added a whole new dimension to the phrase bathroom break. The newly minted eunuch would then be banned from urinating for 3 days, which sounds medically inadvisable because it was. If he survived this phase without his bladder exploding or infection setting in, he was considered successfully castrated. If he didn't, well, the specialist usually offered a money-back guarantee, though the family rarely felt like collecting. The removed parts weren't discarded like medical waste. No, they were carefully preserved in a jar, pickled in alcohol and herbs like the world's most disturbing preserve. This jar, known as the Precious, would follow the eunuch throughout his career. He'd need to present it for job interviews, keep it safe during palace intrigue, and ensure it was buried with him so he could enter the afterlife as a complete man. Lose your jar, lose your afterlife equipment. It was metaphysically terrifying and practically inconvenient, which summed up the eunuch experience quite nicely. But here's where our story takes its first delicious turn toward the absurd. These mutilated children weren't destined for lives of servitude and suffering. Well, not just servitude and suffering. They were being inducted into one of the most powerful shadow organizations in human history. While generals were out there swinging swords and poets were composing odes to plum blossoms, eunuchs were learning the real currency of power: secrets, access, and the ability to poison someone's tea without anyone noticing. The Han Dynasty emperors, in their infinite wisdom mixed with spectacular short-sightedness, had created what they believed was the perfect servant class. After all, what could be more trustworthy than someone who literally couldn't create a rival dynasty? No secret wives hidden in the provinces, no bastard sons waiting to claim the throne, no messy succession crises sprouting from their loins like bamboo after rain. Just pure, undiluted loyalty to the throne, unencumbered by the distractions of family, legacy, or functional genitalia. The logic was beautifully simple and catastrophically flawed. The emperors assumed that men without balls would be men without ambition. They forgot that ambition lives in the mind, not the testicles. They forgot that power has many forms, and the power to stand next to the throne while everyone else must kneel at a distance is a very special form indeed. Most importantly, they forgot that when you take everything away from someone, you create someone with nothing left to lose. Inside the Forbidden City's labyrinthine corridors, eunuchs multiplied like rabbits, metaphorically speaking, of course. They started at the bottom of the palace hierarchy, performing tasks that regular servants found beneath them. Emptying chamber pots, scrubbing floors, standing perfectly still for hours while holding things. But proximity to power has its own gravity, and these ballless wonders soon discovered something remarkable. In a world where bloodlines determined everything, the bloodlineless could go anywhere. They dressed the emperor each morning, selecting which of his 37 robes would best convey imperial majesty, while hiding the wine stains from last night's banquet. They bathed him, learning which spots he liked scratched, and which topics made him anxious. They served his meals, memorizing his favorite dishes, and, more importantly, which foods gave him gas. They stood behind him during court sessions, ostensibly fanning away flies, but actually memorizing every word, every glance, every subtle shift in the political wind. The information they gathered was more valuable than gold, more powerful than armies, more dangerous than assassins. They knew which concubine the emperor favored on Tuesdays, which minister's wife had caught his wandering eye, which general's loyalty was wavering like a reed in the wind. They whispered in imperial ears while trimming imperial fingernails, mixing state secrets with grooming tips in a combination that would determine the fate of millions. The truly clever eunuchs, a natural selection in the palace, meant that only the clever ones survived long, learned to read their masters like oracle bones. Emperor feeling insecure about that new general who just won 3 battles in a row? Perhaps mention how the general's troops had been heard singing suspicious songs. The emperor feeling generous after a particularly satisfying bowel movement. What perfect timing to mention that lovely piece of land that would make an excellent eunuch retirement villa. The emperor feeling paranoid about assassination. Time to remind him how his loyal eunuchs taste all his food and inspect all his visitors, and would never, ever dream of betraying him. Pay no attention to the poison hidden in their sleeves. As the decades rolled by, the eunuch system evolved from a practical solution to a practical problem. The Forbidden City, that sprawling complex of palaces, gardens, and bureaucratic nightmares, housed thousands of women, the emperor's wife, his concubines servants. Intact men couldn't be trusted around such a feminine buffet. But eunuchs? Eunuchs could go anywhere, see anything, touch anyone in a strictly professional capacity, without raising suspicions of impropriety. They became the oil that kept the palace machinery running, the only ones who could navigate between the emperor's public world of ministers and generals and his private world of wives and pillow talk. The palace developed its own eunuch ecosystem, complete with hierarchies, specializations, and career paths. There were bedroom eunuchs who managed the imperial sleeping arrangements, which was far more complicated than it sounds when you have dozens of concubines on a careful rotation. Kitchen eunuchs controlled the imperial menu, and by extension, the imperial digestion. Garden eunuchs maintained the grounds, and occasionally buried bodies in the flower beds. Archive eunuchs managed the imperial records, developing a filing system so complex that only they could navigate it, which was entirely intentional. The smart eunuchs formed alliances, trading favors and information like merchants trading silk. They adopted younger eunuchs as sons, creating artificial families bound by mutual benefit rather than blood. They accumulated wealth through gifts from grateful officials who'd benefited from their influence. They built networks that stretched from the palace latrines to the military command posts, from the imperial bedchamber to the border fortresses. By the end of the Eastern Han period, the imperial court contained more eunuchs than a discount surgery clinic on Black Friday. Some estimates put their number at over 2,000 in the capital alone, not counting the ones scattered throughout the provincial palaces like metastatic corruption. They controlled access to the emperor like nightclub bouncers, with silk robes and better manners. Want to present a petition about land reform? Better hope the chief eunuch likes your face. Need military funding for that crucial border defense? Perhaps a generous donation to the Eunuch Benevolent Association would help your cause. Have evidence of corruption in the treasury? The eunuchs will be happy to file that report right after you explain why you haven't contributed to their temple renovation fund. The transformation from mutilated boys to shadow emperors didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process, like water wearing away stone, if water were made of ambition and stone were made of traditional government structures. Each small favor granted, each secret kept, each rival eliminated, added another layer to their power. They learned that in the palace, as in life, it's not what you know, but who you know. And when you're the only one who knows when the emperor needs to pee, you know everyone. Families across the empire began to see castration not as catastrophe, but as career opportunity. Sure, little Wei won't give us grandchildren, parents would say, mixing resignation with hope, but he might give us a mansion, a monopoly on the salt trade, and the satisfaction of seeing our neighbors grovel. The waiting lists for reputable castrators grew longer. Some entrepreneurs even set up castration academies, offering package deals that included the surgery, basic literacy training, and a letter of introduction to a mid-level palace eunuch. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a castration knife. The very thing that was supposed to make eunuchs powerless, their inability to create heirs, made them indispensable. While nobles worried about which son would inherit their titles, while generals fretted about their family honor, while scholars composed poems about their magnificent lineages, eunuchs focused on the only thing that mattered: accumulating power in the here and now. They couldn't plant family trees, so they planted seeds of corruption instead. They couldn't father children, so they birthed conspiracies. They couldn't create life, so they became very, very good at ending it. In storage rooms throughout the palace, in specially climate-controlled chambers that received better care than most peasants, thousands of jars gathered dust. Each contained the preserved reminder of what its owner had traded for proximity to power. Row upon row of pickled penises and testicles, organized by date and name, like the world's most disturbing library. New eunuchs would sometimes visit these rooms, staring at the jars of their predecessors, wondering if the trade had been worth it. The successful ones, the ones who ended up controlling ministries and toppling dynasties, would later commission elaborate containers for their own preserved parts. Jade bottles, golden boxes, crystal vessels that turned their sacrifice into art. The boys who entered those surgical chambers, as sons of farmers, merchants, or minor officials, emerged as something entirely new. Not quite men, not quite women, but something far more dangerous. Beings who existed outside the normal social order. They had given up the ability to create life, but gained the power to destroy it with a well-placed whisper. A forged document, a cup of tea that tasted slightly too bitter. They had sacrificed their future bloodlines for present power, and in a society obsessed with ancestry, That made them simultaneously worthless and invaluable. The stage was set with silk curtains and blood-stained floors. The players were in position, their missing parts preserved in jars like trophies of their ambition. The Empire was about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous men in the room are the ones with the least to lose and the most creative ideas about what to do with a knife. And somewhere in the palace archives, next to the tax records and the poetry collections, clerks were beginning to note a curious trend. The eunuchs were becoming very, very rich, and their enemies were becoming very, very dead. But that's a story for Chapter 2. For now, picture those golden halls again, but see them as they really were. A factory for creating the most ambitious, ruthless, and paradoxically powerful servants the world had ever seen. Men who had traded their manhood for a chance at immortality, not through children, but through the chaos they could create. The knife that took their testicles had given them the empire. They just had to figure out what to do with it. While generals played chess with armies on distant battlefields, moving troops like pieces across the vast board of China, eunuchs played a different game entirely. Their board was smaller, just the few square miles of the Forbidden City, but their pieces were far more valuable. They moved emperors. The true rise of eunuch power began with Emperor Ling of Han, who ascended to the throne in 168 CE with all the political acumen of a particularly sheltered goldfish. At the tender age of 12, he was more interested in the important questions of life than the mundane matters of governance. Could donkeys be trained to pull the imperial chariot in formation? What would happen if he replaced all the court musicians with trained monkeys? If he decreed that purple was actually yellow, would everyone have to agree? These were the deep philosophical musings that occupied the imperial mind while the empire quietly rotted from within. The eunuchs noticed his unique approach to leadership. Oh, how they noticed. Where others saw an incompetent child playing dress-up in his father's robes, the eunuchs saw opportunity, dressed in imperial yellow. Chief among these opportunists was Zhang Rang, a man who had transformed the absence of testicles into the presence of an empire-wide intelligence network. Zhang understood something fundamental about power that had escaped generations of Confucian scholars. It wasn't about sitting on the throne. It was about controlling who got close enough to smell the throne's upholstery. Zhang and his associates, a carefully curated collection of the empire's most ambitious castrati, began what historians would later recognize as a soft coup. No armies marched, no blood was shed initially, no dramatic proclamations were issued. Instead, they simply made themselves indispensable, which in palace politics is the equivalent of a military victory. The transformation started with Emperor Ling's daily routine. The eunuchs controlled when he woke, usually late, what he ate, lots of sweets, who he saw, only pre-approved visitors, and what information reached his imperial ears, heavily edited for convenience. They created a bubble around the emperor so complete, so comfortable, that he never felt the need to pop it. Why venture into the harsh world of actual governance when his eunuch friends had made the palace so entertaining? Emperor Ling's most famous project was the construction of a market street within the palace grounds. Not a metaphorical market, mind you, but an actual functioning commercial district where the emperor could play shopkeeper. He would dress in merchant clothes, haggle over prices, and sell goods to courtiers who had to pretend to be common customers. The eunuchs not only encouraged this bizarre hobby, but built it into an elaborate fantasy. They hired actors to play difficult customers, scripted dramatic commercial disputes for the emperor to resolve, and made sure he always turned a profit. Meanwhile, the real commerce of the empire, the grain shipments, the tax collections, the military supplies, flowed through eunuch hands. The genius of the eunuch system lay in its opacity. Traditional Chinese government operated on documentation, precedent, and the occasional public execution to keep everyone honest. The eunuch government operated on whispers, implications, and private executions that looked remarkably like natural causes. They created a parallel administration that was somehow both completely visible and entirely invisible. Everyone knew the eunuchs held power. No one could quite explain how the system worked. It was like trying to map fog. Take, for instance, the case of Minister Chen. a competent administrator with the fatal flaw of competence. He suggested that perhaps the emperor should spend less time playing shopkeeper and more time addressing the Yellow River flooding that had displaced 2 million people. Within a week, Minister Chen discovered that his son had allegedly been involved in a conspiracy to sell government grain to bandits. The evidence was overwhelming: signed documents in the son's hand, witness testimony from 3 separate sources, and a convenient cache of gold discovered under the family's garden pavilion. Minister Chen protested his son's innocence, which was a mistake. The investigation expanded. Suddenly there were questions about Chen's own loyalty. Hadn't he been seen speaking with a known dissident? Didn't his wife's cousin's husband once write a poem that could be interpreted as critical of palace spending? Why did his account show a discrepancy of 3 copper coins from 5 years ago? Within a month, Minister Chen was gone, executed for corruption, his family exiled, his property confiscated, and somehow ending up in eunuch hands. The emperor, informed of the shocking betrayal by his trusted minister, sighed dramatically and went back to arranging his shop displays. The eunuchs expressed their deep sorrow at Chen's betrayal while dividing up his library. This became the template for eunuch political operations. They didn't simply remove obstacles, they transformed obstacles into object lessons. Every fallen official became a warning to others. Every confiscated estate became a reward for eunuch loyalty. Every execution became a reminder that in the palace there were only 2 types of people: eunuchs and potential victims. The 10 attendants, as Zhang Rang's inner circle came to be known, developed specializations that would make modern government departments jealous. Zhao Zhong managed imperial finances, which meant he controlled both the money coming in and the money going out, with a significant percentage somehow getting lost in the middle. Duan Gei oversaw justice, ensuring that the law was applied with all the consistency of a drunk calligrapher. Sun Jiang controlled military appointments, which explained why so many generals suddenly discovered they needed to make large donations to eunuch-supported temples. Each member of the 10 attendants built his own network of subordinate eunuchs, who in turn recruited their own followers. It was a pyramid scheme where the currency was influence and the product was corruption. A junior eunuch in the kitchen might report to a senior eunuch in the bedroom department, who answered to one of the 10 attendants, who whispered to Zhang Rang, who controlled the emperor's breakfast conversation. Information flowed up, power flowed down, and money flowed everywhere. The eunuch's intelligence network would have made modern surveillance states weep with envy. Every servant was a potential informant. Every guard might be on the payroll. Every concubine could be persuaded to share pillow talk. They knew which ministers visited prostitutes, all of them, which generals skimmed from military supplies, most of them, and which scholars were writing unflattering poetry about the emperor's intellectual capabilities, the brave ones. But information without action is just gossip, and the eunuchs were not gossips. They were social engineers. When General Lu won a decisive victory against northern barbarians, the eunuchs made sure the emperor heard how the general's men had looted temples. When Minister Wang proposed tax reform that might actually work, the eunuchs discovered he'd been having an affair with his sister-in-law. When scholar Zhou wrote a memorial criticizing palace expenditure, he mysteriously developed a fatal case of food poisoning just before he could present it. The commercialization of government positions became so systematic it practically had a price list. Want to be a county magistrate? That'll be 5,000 gold pieces. Prefer a cushier job as a grain inspector? 7,500, but that includes the right to skim 10% off the top. Dreaming of a provincial governorship? 20,000 gold pieces, a virgin daughter for the harem, and a public declaration of loyalty to the 10 attendants. This system had the elegant effect of ensuring that only the corrupt could afford to govern. Honest men of modest means found themselves permanently stuck in low-level positions, watching as wealthy incompetents bought their way up the ladder. The eunuchs always had leverage over these purchased officials. After all, everyone knew how they'd gotten their jobs. It was mutually assured corruption. The eunuchs also pioneered new forms of financial innovation. They created what modern economists might recognize as a futures market in government positions. Young men from wealthy families could buy options on future appointments, paying the eunuchs annually for the promise of a position when one became available. If the young man died or fell into disgrace before his appointment, the eunuchs kept the money. If a better offer came along, the eunuchs kept the money and sold the position to someone else. It was brilliant, ruthless, and completely legal because the eunuchs wrote the laws. Emperor Ling, meanwhile, remained blissfully oblivious to his growing irrelevance. His days were filled with increasingly elaborate distractions, all carefully orchestrated by his eunuch minders. When he expressed interest in Buddhism, the eunuchs built him a private temple staffed by fake monks, who assured him he was the reincarnation of a bodhisattva. When he developed a passion for exotic animals, they created a private zoo, where the animals were trained to bow when he approached. When he decided he wanted to experience military life, they constructed a fake military camp, where he could play general while actual generals were being undermined by eunuch appointments. The most audacious of Emperor Ling's projects was his decision to sell official positions himself, apparently inspired by his marketplace games. The eunuchs, who had been doing this quietly for years, enthusiastically supported the imperial entrepreneurship. They set up an official price list, carved in stone and displayed in the palace. Provincial governor, 20 million cash. Commander of the palace guard, 10 million. Minister of Finance, 30 million. The prices were so high that only the ultra-wealthy could afford them, which meant that only the ultra-corrupt took the jobs, which meant the eunuchs controlled everyone. The Confucian scholars, those perpetual thorns in the side of anyone having fun with power, tried to resist. They wrote elegant memorials about virtue, righteousness, and the mandate of heaven. They quoted ancient texts about the danger of allowing incomplete men to wield complete power. They organized study groups that were definitely not conspiracies to discuss classical literature that was definitely not criticism of the current regime. The eunuch's response was characteristically efficient. First, they had the emperor issue an edict praising the scholars for their devotion to learning. Then they had him establish a new academy for classical studies, with generous funding and beautiful facilities. Then they arrested everyone who showed up on charges of seditious assembly. It was elegant in its simplicity. Let your enemies identify themselves, then eliminate them all at once. The partisan prohibitions, as these purges came to be known, removed hundreds of scholars from public life. Some were executed for treason they hadn't committed. Others were exiled to border regions where their classical education was somewhat less useful than knowledge of farming in frozen wastelands. The lucky ones were merely banned from holding office, condemned to watch from the sidelines as eunuchs and their puppets destroyed everything the scholars held dear. But the eunuchs' greatest trick was making themselves seem inevitable. They created such a complex web of mutual dependence that even their enemies couldn't imagine government without them. Who else knew the filing system? Who else could navigate palace protocol? Who else understood the emperor's moods, preferences, and digestive issues? The eunuchs had made themselves the operating system of the empire, and like any operating system, replacing them seemed more trouble than it was worth. By the 180s CE, the Han Empire was essentially a eunuch corporation with an emperor as its mascot. Foreign ambassadors quickly learned the real protocol: bring two sets of gifts, one official set for the emperor and a much nicer, unofficial set for the eunuchs. Military campaigns were approved or rejected based on how much the generals were willing to contribute to the eunuch pension fund. Justice was dispensed with all the fairness of a rigged carnival game, where the carnies controlled both the wheel and the prizes. The eunuchs grew so bold they began adopting imperial mannerisms. Zhang Rang travelled with an entourage that rivaled the emperor's, complete with musicians, dancers, and food tasters. His mansion in Luoyang featured gardens designed to surpass the imperial parks, with artificial mountains, exotic birds, and a pond shaped like the empire, with little boats representing the provinces under his control. He held court sessions where officials would present their cases to him before daring to approach the emperor. He even had his own ray name that his subordinates used in private documents. The other attendants were no less ambitious. Zhao Jian built a private army disguised as household guards, equipped with weapons for ceremonial purposes, that looked suspiciously functional. Duan Gi established his own intelligence network within the eunuch intelligence network, because in a world of professional paranoids, you can never be too paranoid. Olan, in perhaps the strangest display of eunuch excess, collected concubines he couldn't use, apparently just to prove he could. But success breeds excess, and excess breeds resentment. The eunuchs had created the perfect system for accumulating power, but they'd forgotten that perfect systems have a tendency to collapse perfectly. The Yellow River, with its impeccable sense of dramatic timing, chose this moment to flood catastrophically. Millions were displaced, crops were destroyed, and the treasury, already depleted by eunuch embezzlement, couldn't handle the relief efforts. The eunuch response was predictably tone-deaf. They raised taxes on the survivors to pay for flood relief, then pocketed most of the relief funds. They conscripted flood victims to build new eunuch mansions, reasoning that construction work was a form of employment. They had the emperor issue proclamations, blaming the floods on the people's lack of virtue, while selling the timber meant for flood barriers to fund palace renovations. Storm clouds were gathering, both meteorological and political. The empire teetered on the edge of chaos, while the eunuchs counted their gold and compared castration scars at increasingly decadent parties. They had created the perfect shadow government, answerable to no one, constrained by nothing except their own imagination and the occasional outbreak of sepsis from their old wounds. The emperor continued to play shopkeeper in his palace market, blissfully unaware that the real merchants were selling his empire, piece by piece. He would die in 189 CE, never understanding that his reign had been a puppet show, where the puppeteers had no testicles, but plenty of balls. And somewhere in the palace archives, next to the jars of pickled genitals and the forged documents, the foundations of Chinese civilization were quietly rotting away. The eunuchs had won. They controlled everything, which in the cruel mathematics of history meant they were about to lose everything. But that's a story for Chapter 3. For now, picture the empire at the height of eunuch power, a vast nation run by men who couldn't father children but had no problem murdering them, who couldn't create dynasties but excelled at destroying them, who had transformed their physical incompleteness into complete political dominance. The deep state had never been deeper, or more castrated. At the height of absurdity, China wasn't ruled by emperors, it was ruled by their babysitters. The year 189 CE opened with Emperor Ling on his deathbed, coughing up blood while his eunuch attendants quietly rifled through his jewellery box. His reign had been 30 years of aggressive mediocrity, punctuated by moments of spectacular incompetence, and now it was ending as it had begun, with other people making all the important decisions. The dying emperor left behind 2 sons and a power vacuum so intense it could have sucked the paint off the palace walls. His elder son, Liu Bian, was all of 14 years old, that magical age where you're old enough to have opinions, but too young for anyone to care about them. His younger half-brother, Liu Shi, was 8, which, in palace years, meant he was still young enough to be properly moulded into whatever shape his handlers preferred. Between them stood the eunuchs, rubbing their soft hands together and calculating which prince would make the more manageable puppet. But the eunuchs had competition. Empress Dowager He, the mother of Liu Bian, was what historians politely call ambitious, and what everyone else called terrifying. She had clawed her way up from butcher's daughter to imperial consort to empress to dowager, leaving a trail of mysterious deaths and convenient accidents in her wake. The kind of woman who could stare down a tiger and make it apologize for existing. She had her own ideas about succession, and those ideas specifically excluded anyone with a suspicious lack of male anatomy. The succession crisis played out like a particularly dark comedy. The eunuchs supported Liu Bian initially, reasoning that a 14-year-old would be easier to control than his grandmother. They had the dying Emperor Ling issue a deathbed edict confirming Liu Bian as heir, though witnesses noted the emperor seemed surprisingly articulate for someone choking on his own blood. The eunuch Zhang Rang personally read out the imperial will, his high-pitched voice lending an unintentionally comedic air to the solemn occasion. Liu Bian ascended to the throne with all the confidence of a mouse at a cat convention. The coronation ceremony was a masterpiece of stage management, with the eunuchs choreographing every moment. They dressed him in robes so heavy he could barely walk, placed a crown on his head that gave him migraines, and surrounded him with advisors who whispered contradictory advice in both ears simultaneously. The poor boy spent his first day as emperor asking when he could go back to his regular room, and whether being the son of heaven meant he still had to do his calligraphy homework. The morning routine in the Forbidden City evolved into a bizarre puppet show. The teenage emperor would wake to find his daily schedule already prepared by his eunuch advisors, every moment accounted for, every decision pre-made. "Your Majesty will be graciously holding court at the second hour," they would announce, as if he had a choice. "Your Majesty will be reviewing these pre-approved judgments at the third hour. Your Majesty will be signing these definitely not forged documents at the fourth hour. The afternoon is reserved for imperial nap time, because Your Majesty is looking peaked." The eunuchs had reached the pinnacle of their behind-the-curtain careers. No longer content with merely whispering suggestions, they now spoke with the emperor's voice. Literally. Young Liu Bian would barely stammer through the first line of a decree before Chief Eunuch Zhang Rang would helpfully clarify what His Majesty had really meant to say. These clarifications usually involved giving the eunuchs more money, more power, or more of their enemies' severed heads. Funny how that worked. But Empress Dowager, he was not about to let a bunch of general-free social climbers control her son and, by extension, her empire. She began her own power plays, appointing her brother He Jin as general-in-chief. He Jin was unique among high officials in that he had started his career as an actual butcher, which gave him practical experience in cutting things apart that would soon prove useful. The irony of a butcher facing off against men who'd been butchered was lost on no one, except possibly He Jin himself, who wasn't known for his appreciation of irony. The palace became a chessboard where every piece was potentially poisonous and the rules changed depending on who was counting. The Empress Dowager would issue a decree, the eunuchs would quietly file it in their "ignore this" pile. The eunuchs would promote their allies, the Empress Dowager would have them mysteriously develop fatal food allergies. Officials would arrive for morning court, unsure whether they'd leave with a promotion or without their heads. It was bureaucratic warfare with a body count that would have impressed Genghis Khan. The teenage emperor, caught between his terrifying grandmother and his testicle-free advisors, tried to assert some authority. He once attempted to hold a private meeting with his ministers without eunuch supervision. He managed approximately 5 minutes of independent thought before Zhang Rang burst through the door, expressing deep concern for His Majesty's health. Apparently, discussing state policy without eunuch oversight could lead to dangerous conditions like actual governance and independent decision-making. The emperor was quickly whisked away for his own protection. The eunuch's control system was magnificently comprehensive. They managed the emperor's education, ensuring he learned just enough classical texts to sound imperial, but not enough to understand concepts like constitutional limits or checks and balances. They controlled his social circle, surrounding him with carefully selected young nobles who were either too stupid to pose a threat or too compromised to dare try. They even regulated his diet, claiming certain foods were bad for the imperial constitution, especially foods that might give him enough energy to stay awake during late-night discussions of actual policy. But the real genius lay in their manipulation of information. The emperor only knew what the eunuchs wanted him to know. Reports from the provinces were edited for convenience. Military dispatches were creatively interpreted. Economic data was more fictional than the palace theatre performances. They created an alternate reality so complete that the emperor once expressed surprise upon learning that peasants didn't actually enjoy paying taxes. The eunuchs also controlled the emperor's sex life, which for a 14-year-old was both extremely important and extremely awkward. They selected which concubines he would visit, when he would visit them, and for how long. They prepared aphrodisiacs when they wanted him distracted, and sleeping potions when they needed him unconscious for important forged signatures. They even provided helpful illustrated manuals, though given their own anatomical limitations, one wonders about the accuracy of their advice. Meanwhile, the power struggle between the eunuchs and the Empress Dowager escalated into open warfare, albeit the kind of warfare where everyone smiled and bowed while sharpening their knives. He Jin, displaying the strategic subtlety that made him an excellent butcher and a terrible politician, decided the solution was simple: kill all the eunuchs. Not some of them, not the corrupt ones, all of them. Every single man in the palace who couldn't produce testicles on demand would die. He began gathering troops outside the capital, sending messages to regional commanders that essentially read, "Dear fellow general, please bring your army to help me murder all the ballless wonders. RSVP with troop numbers. P.S. This is definitely not treason." The eunuchs, faced with an existential threat to their existence, did what they did best. they got creative with documentation. They forged an imperial summons ordering He Jin to the palace for an urgent, private, definitely not suspicious meeting. The summons bore the emperor's seal, which was convenient since the eunuchs controlled the seal. It requested He Jin come alone, immediately, through the back gate, carrying no weapons, wearing his best clothes that would show bloodstains really well. He Jin, displaying the kind of judgment that suggested his brains might have been left in his butcher shop, walked right into the palace. The light, unarmed, at night, to meet with people who had publicly vowed to kill him. It was like watching a sheep deliver itself to the slaughterhouse if sheep could achieve the rank of general-in-chief. The meeting was brief and pointed. Mostly pointed, actually, as in sharp objects pointed at He Jin from multiple directions. The eunuchs, showing admirable efficiency, had him dismembered in the same professional manner he'd once dismembered cattle. They then had his various parts delivered to his family in tastefully arranged baskets, because, even in murder, presentation matters. This triggered what historians delicately call the War of the Eunuchs, and what everyone else called, that time the palace went completely insane. He Jin's troops, upon receiving their general in kit form, stormed the palace gates. The eunuchs barricaded themselves in the inner palace with both the emperor and his younger brother as hostages, though, given their previous relationship, it was hard to tell who was holding whom hostage. The next few hours were pure chaos, served with a side of farce. Soldiers rampaged through the palace, checking every servant's trousers with scholarly dedication. The eunuchs tried to escape by various creative means, hiding in large vases, dressing as women, which worked about as well as you'd expect for men with 5 o'clock shadows, and, in one memorable case, trying to fly off the palace walls with makeshift wings. The emperor found himself bundled from room to room like a particularly valuable piece of furniture, with different factions claiming to be rescuing him from other factions who were also claiming to be rescuing him. In desperation, the eunuchs played their final card. They set fire to the palace. Not metaphorically. Literally. Actual flames consuming actual buildings containing actual priceless artifacts of Chinese civilization. The logic, apparently, was that if they couldn't rule the palace, no one would rule the palace. Or possibly they were just cold and confused matches with important documents. The historical record is unclear, possibly because the historical record was on fire. As the flames rose and the situation deteriorated from crisis to apocalypse with comedic elements, the eunuchs made their last desperate gambit. They grabbed both Liu Bian and his younger brother, stuffed them into common carriages, and fled the burning capital. Picture, if you will, the Son of Heaven, the divine emperor of all China, bouncing along rutted roads in a cart designed for vegetables, surrounded by panicking eunuchs still trying to maintain court protocol. Your Majesty, would you prefer the left or right side of this ditch we're about to hide in? Should we bow before or after jumping into the sewage canal? Does the mandate of heaven cover fleeing in terror from one's own capital? Behind them, the capital burned with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for New Year's celebrations. Centuries of archives went up in smoke, which was convenient for everyone who had embarrassing documentation on file. Tax records, land deeds, evidence of massive corruption, all transformed into a lovely light show that could be seen for miles. The eunuchs had finally achieved the ultimate bureaucratic solution. If you can't hide the evidence, incinerate it. The escape attempt was doomed from the start. You can't exactly travel incognito when your party includes 2 boys in imperial yellow and several dozen men with distinctly high-pitched voices arguing about proper forms of address. They made it about as far as you'd expect, just outside the capital, before being surrounded by various armed groups, each claiming to be the legitimate rescue party. What followed was essentially a live auction, where different warlords bid for imperial legitimacy. The eunuchs, recognizing that their game was up but still trying to control the narrative, made one last manipulation. They declared the younger brother Liu Xie as the new emperor, deposing Liu Bian on the grounds that he was too old and experienced at 14. If they were going down, they'd at least choose which puppet would dance for the next strongman. The various warlords were confused. Wait, which one was emperor now? The older one who'd been emperor that morning, or the younger one who'd just been promoted by soon-to-be-dead eunuchs? Did it matter? To get a receipt. In the chaos, With the capital still burning and armies converging from all directions, nobody was entirely sure who was in charge of what. The eunuchs managed to create just enough confusion to buy time for, well, nothing really. There was no phase 2 to their plan. They'd played every card, pulled every string, and now the puppet show was over. One by one, the great eunuch powers fell. Some threw themselves into wells, choosing a watery grave over whatever creative execution the soldiers had planned. Others tried to negotiate, offering vast treasures they'd accumulated over decades of corruption. The soldiers took the treasure maps and killed them anyway, proving that dishonor among thieves was still more honorable than being a eunuch. Zhang Rang, the mastermind of eunuch supremacy, the shadow emperor who'd ruled through 3 actual emperors, met his end at the Yellow River. Pursued by soldiers who'd really like to discuss his recent policy decisions with swords, he stood at the bank, facing a choice: capture or current. He chose the river, either jumping or being enthusiastically pushed. Accounts vary depending on how much the historian enjoyed the imagery. His last words were reportedly a curse on all intact men, though the splash rather ruined the dramatic effect. Young Emperor Liu Bian's reign ended as it began, with other people making decisions for him. He was politely deposed by the warlord Dong Zhuo, who had arrived late to the party but made up for it with enthusiasm. Deposed, in ancient China being a euphemism for poisoned with extreme prejudice, Liu Bian transitioned from emperor to ancestor in record time. His younger brother, the eunuch's final puppet, became Emperor Xian, a name meaning dedicated, though what he was mainly dedicated to was surviving, while various warlords used him as a legitimacy trophy. The eunuch's stranglehold on power, built over decades of careful manipulation, collapsed in a matter of days. All those carefully cultivated networks, those mountains of blackmail material, those private armies, those jars of preserved genitals, none of it mattered when faced with actual armies led by men with both military training and functioning reproductive systems. As the smoke cleared over the capital, as bodies were cleared from the palace grounds, as the new strongmen divided up the empire like a particularly corrupt birthday cake, observers might have noticed the cosmic irony. The eunuchs had spent so long preventing others from threatening the throne that they'd forgotten to prevent themselves from becoming the threat. They'd been so busy rewriting imperial edicts that they'd failed to read the writing on the wall, even when that writing was in letters of fire 50 feet high. The young Emperor Xian sat on his throne, or rather, was placed on his throne by whoever was controlling him that week, and contemplated his fate. At 8 years old, he'd already seen more palace coups than birthday parties. He'd learned that trust was something you gave to people right before they betrayed you, that power was something you held right before someone took it, and that the only constant in imperial life was that someone, somewhere, was plotting your demise. But the story wasn't over. Not all eunuchs died in the purge. Some escaped to the provinces, carrying their knowledge of palace intrigue to regional courts. Others hid in plain sight, pretending to be regular servants with unfortunate high-pitched voices and an unusual interest in court protocol. And in the shadows of the new regime they waited and watched, because if there's one thing history teaches us, it's that power abhors a vacuum almost as much as nature does. And sometimes that vacuum is both metaphorical and anatomical. The Empire had learned a valuable lesson. When you create a class of people with nothing to lose but everything to gain, don't be surprised when they take everything. The eunuchs had ruled from behind the throne, through the throne, and occasionally on the throne when no one was looking. They'd proven that in the Game of Thrones, you don't need bulls to play. You just need everyone else to think you do. Take a moment, here comes the backlash. In the smoking ruins of the capital, where the smell of burnt silk mixed with the distinctive aroma of regime change, a new phase of the eunuch saga began. Officials who'd spent years bowing to bore-less bureaucrats suddenly discovered their spines. Scholars who'd written coded criticisms in classical verse now spoke in plain, murderous prose. Even dowager empresses, those perpetual survivors of palace intrigue, decided it was time to claw back control. The result was a whirlwind of purges, imprisonments, and retaliations that would make a Roman senator blush and a Borgia pope take notes. The year was still 189 CE, though so much had happened it felt like a decade compressed into months. The capital still smouldered from the eunuch's farewell bonfire, and the air tasted of ash and opportunity. The great eunuch purge had begun with Hijin's dismemberment, a butcher butchered by the butchered, and escalated into what could charitably be called enthusiastic cleanup, and more accurately called revenge-fueled genocide with administrative characteristics. Leading the anti-eunuch forces was Yuan Shao, a man with all the subtle political instincts of a sledgehammer in a china shop. Yuan came from one of those aristocratic families that traced their lineage back to the Yellow Emperor, and their wealth back to creative tax collection. He had watched the eunuchs corrupt everything he held dear, and now he had an army, a grudge, and absolutely no sense of proportion. Yuan Shao's strategy was refreshingly direct. Kill every eunuch, then figure out who should have lived later. He issued orders that any man without a beard should be executed on sight, which led to some awkward moments for naturally smooth-faced officials, teenage boys, and one very nervous Empress Yen, who at 8 years old wasn't exactly sporting a magnificent whisker collection. Soldiers roamed the streets with a simple identification test that would have made the Spanish Inquisition proud. Drop your pants or lose your head. Sometimes both, if the soldiers were feeling thorough. But the eunuchs weren't going quietly into that good night, or any night. They dug in like ticks on a particularly appetizing dog, if ticks had access to poison. Private armies and comprehensive blackmail files. Some took over palace guard units, turning them into private armies through the simple expedient of paying triple wages and promising not to check anyone's genital status. Others launched counter-coups with the determination of men who had already lost their balls and weren't about to lose their heads too. The Forbidden City transformed into a pressure cooker of betrayal, where today's ally was tomorrow's corpse and the only constant was chaos. Every morning brought new executions, carried out with the kind of ceremonial precision that only a civilization with 3,000 years of practice could achieve. The executioner's sword became the busiest tool in government, working longer hours than any minister and with better job security. All in the name of restoring order, of course, because nothing says return to stable governance quite like daily beheadings in the throne room. The eunuchs, desperate and creative in equal measure, tried everything in their arsenal of dirty tricks. Some attempted to fort up in the inner palace, turning the emperor's quarters into a makeshift fortress. They barricaded doors with priceless furniture, stationed guards at every entrance, and stockpiled weapons that ranged from standard swords to exotic poisons that could kill a man while making it look like he'd died of excessive poetry appreciation. They even tried to recruit the palace women to their cause, arguing that incomplete men and complete women had common cause against the patriarchy, an argument that might have worked better if the eunuchs hadn't spent decades treating the palace women like particularly decorative furniture. Others tried the diplomatic approach, sending messages to various warlords offering vast treasures in exchange for protection. "Dear General," these messages typically began, "we hear you enjoy gold, power, and not having your food poisoned. We can help with all three." The treasures on offer were naturally from the imperial vaults, but ownership is such a fluid concept when you're facing decapitation. Several warlords expressed interest until they realized that taking eunuch money was like accepting cursed gold. It came with political leprosy and usually a knife in the back. The most creative eunuchs attempted to blend in with regular servants, hoping to weather the storm through camouflage. This worked about as well as you'd expect for men who'd spent decades in luxury developing soft hands, refined manners, and an inability to perform actual manual labor without writing a formal complaint. One eunuch was caught when he tried to carry water buckets and immediately requested a sedan chair. Another gave himself away by critiquing the grammatical structure of his own death warrant. A third was discovered when he tried to hide among the stable boys, but couldn't stop giving the horses pedicures. Meanwhile, the violence escalated with baroque creativity that would have impressed the most demented Roman emperor. The eunuchs were hunted through the palace gardens like particularly well-dressed rabbits. They were flushed out of ornamental pagodas where they'd hidden among the statuary, their lack of certain anatomical features making them blend in better with the marble sculptures. Some were discovered hiding in large vases, leading to the darkly comic scene of soldiers playing a lethal version of hide-and-seek, tapping on pottery and listening for high-pitched squeaks. The soldiers, a mix of professional killers and enthusiastic amateurs, made a game of the hunt. They awarded points for style, Finding a eunuch hiding in a dragon costume was worth 5 points. Catching one trying to escape through the sewers was worth 10, and discovering one who'd been posing as a statue for 3 days was worth a promotion. The scoring system was written in blood, literally on the palace walls. The scholars, those perpetual moral guardians of Chinese civilization, seized their moment with the glee of teachers who'd just caught their bullies alone in the playground. They'd spent decades writing strongly worded memorials about eunuch corruption, coding their criticism in classical allusions that went over most people's heads. Now they could speak plainly, and what they had to say involved a lot of creative suggestions for eunuch punishment that proved classical education didn't preclude sadistic imagination. They formed tribunals with all the fairness of a witch trial, where the witches were real, but the crimes were mostly invented. Every official who'd held a position in the last 20 years was investigated for eunuch connections. The standards for guilt were refreshingly low. Had you ever accepted a eunuch bribe? Guilty. Had you ever refused a eunuch bribe but not reported it? Also guilty. Had you ever nodded politely to a eunuch in the corridor? Suspiciously guilty. Had you never interacted with eunuchs at all? Clearly you were hiding something. The trials were spectacular theatre, combining the worst aspects of legal proceedings with the best aspects of blood sport. Accusations flew like poisoned arrows at a particularly hostile archery competition. Minister Wang accepted 500 gold pieces to approve the grain shipment. General Li's promotion was purchased for 1,000 gold and his daughter's virginity. Scholar Zhou once shared a poem with a eunuch. That last one was considered especially damning, as it suggested intellectual collaboration with the testicularly challenged. But here's where the story takes a delicious turn toward the absurd. The eunuchs, facing annihilation, decided that if they were going down, they'd take everyone with them. They began releasing documents from their extensive archives, decades of meticulously recorded bribes, favors, and embarrassments. It was like WikiLeaks, if WikiLeaks were run by vindictive castrati with nothing left to lose. One particularly vindictive eunuch named Chaojie, before his execution, stood in the public square and recited from memory a comprehensive list of every official who'd ever paid a bribe, complete with dates, amounts, and what favors were purchased. The recitation took 3 hours and implicated roughly 80% of the government. By the end, half the court was looking distinctly uncomfortable, and the other half was mentally calculating whether they could kill CAO before he got to their names. They couldn't. He finished the list, smiled sweetly, and then was promptly separated from his head, which continued smiling for several disturbing seconds. The revelations created a cascade of paranoia. Officials who'd been enthusiastically purging eunuchs suddenly found themselves accused of eunuch collaboration. Generals who'd led the charge against the castrated conspiracy discovered documents proving they'd bought their commissions. Scholars who'd written moral treatises about governmental purity were revealed to have solicited eunuch help for their sons' examinations. It was mutually assured destruction, except one side was already destroyed, so they had nothing to lose. The Emperor Xian, now 9 years old and developing the 1,000-yard stare of a war veteran, watched this chaos with the detachment of someone who'd learned that safety was an illusion and adults were just taller children with sharper weapons. He was regularly brought execution orders to sign, though it's doubtful he understood what he was authorizing. The conversations went something like this. Your Majesty, please sign here to execute the treacherous eunuchs. Are these the men who used to bring me candy? Yes, Your Majesty. The ones who told me bedtime stories. The very same, Your Majesty. Oh, I liked their stories. They had dragons. The dragons were metaphors for corruption, Your Majesty. What to metaphor? Just sign here, Your Majesty. The counter-coups launched by desperate eunuchs were spectacular failures that nonetheless provided entertainment for the masses. One group tried to seize control of the imperial armory, reasoning that weapons would level the playing field. They succeeded in breaking in, only to discover that knowing where weapons were stored and knowing how to use them were very different skills. The image of eunuchs trying to figure out crossbow mechanics while soldiers broke down the doors would be comedic if it weren't so pathetically fatal. Most died still reading the instruction manuals. Another group attempted to kidnap important hostages for leverage. They managed to grab what they thought was the war minister's son, but turned out to be his nephew's calligraphy tutor. The war minister was mildly annoyed at the inconvenience. The calligraphy tutor was traumatized into writing very shaky characters for the rest of his life. The eunuchs were extremely dead, though they did leave behind beautifully written ransom notes that were later used as examples of proper formal correspondence. As the purge continued, it began to eat its own tail, like a particularly self-destructive dragon. Officials who'd been too successful under eunuch rule became suspect, regardless of their actual involvement. The interrogations were masterpieces of circular logic. How did you become so wealthy, Minister Zhang? Through wise investments and frugal living. What kind of investments? Land, primarily, and some shipping ventures. Land purchased from whom? Various sellers. I have all the documentation. Documentation that conveniently burned in the palace fire. I keep copies at home. The home you purchased with your suspicious wealth? It's not suspicious wealth. That's exactly what someone with suspicious wealth would say. The body count mounted with mathematical precision. By conservative estimates, over 2,000 eunuchs died in the capital alone, plus an unknown number of associates, sympathizers, and people who just looked suspicious. The palace guards, caught between old loyalties and new realities, developed a convenient moral flexibility. They would vigorously hunt eunuchs when important people were watching, then develop sudden blindness when exhausted castrati tried to slip out the back gates. Some guards even ran a side business selling escape routes, though they usually collected payment then killed the escapees anyway. It was exhausting being that entrepreneurially evil. In the provinces, the purge took on regional characteristics. Local governors used it as an excuse to settle old scores, eliminate rivals, and seize property. The definition of eunuch collaborator expanded to include anyone the accuser didn't like, owed money to, or whose wife was attractive. Merchants who'd never set foot in the capital found themselves accused of selling supplies to eunuchs. Scholars who'd written poems about flowers were investigated for using eunuch imagery. Apparently anything missing something could be considered symbolic. Even farmers discovered that their successful harvest were suspicious. Clearly they must have received eunuch agricultural advice. The most pathetic victims were the elderly eunuchs, who'd served in the palace since before most of their persecutors were born. These men had nowhere to go, no families to return to, no skills beyond knowing exactly how much sugar the third emperor ago had liked in his tea. Some were found days after the initial purge, still hiding in the palace, apparently hoping everyone would forget about them if they stayed very, very quiet. Others wandered the streets in their silk robes, begging for food from people who'd once begged them for favors. The lucky ones died quickly. The unlucky ones lived long enough to see everything they'd built burned to ash. But the real winners weren't the righteous scholars or the vengeful generals, or even the opportunistic warlords. The real winners were the archivists, who inherited the eunuch records. Thousands of documents detailing every bribe, every conspiracy, every embarrassing secret of the last century. It was a treasure trove of blackmail material that would keep ambitious officials busy for generations. The eunuchs were dead, but their bureaucratic legacy lived on, poisoning Chinese politics like a gift that kept on giving. By the time the bloodletting ended, the palace was a very different place. Quieter, certainly. The absence of high-pitched voices was noticeable. Less organized, definitely. Say what you would about eunuchs, they'd kept excellent records. More honest? That was debatable. The new administration simply had different forms of corruption, less centralized but no less thorough. The survivors, and there are always survivors in Chinese politics, learned valuable lessons. First, when choosing sides in a palace coup, pick the one with actual testicles and actual weapons. Second, blackmail is less effective when your victims can legally murder you. Third, and most importantly, when the empire starts burning, it's time to update your resume and consider opportunities in the private sector. As the blood was mopped up and the bodies were carted away, the going rate for corpse removal had tripled due to demand. China discovered it had traded one problem for several others. The eunuchs were gone, but so was any semblance of central authority. The empire fractured like a dropped vase, each piece claimed by a different warlord who promised to restore order right after he finished conquering his neighbors. The young Emperor Xian sat on his throne, signing whatever was put in front of him, probably wondering if the eunuch's candy had been worth all this trouble. Around him, the new masters of China plotted and schemed, proving that you didn't need to be castrated to be dangerously ambitious. You just needed to survive the purge and learn from the mistakes of those who didn't. The eunuch system had been cut out like the cancer it was, but the patient the Han Dynasty was dying anyway. Sometimes the cure is worse than the disease, especially when the cure involves thousands of sword fatalities. But in the provinces, in hidden safe houses and remote monasteries, some eunuchs survived. They shaved their heads, changed their names, and pretended to be monks with unusually high voices and detailed knowledge of palace etiquette. They waited and watched, because they knew something the celebrating soldiers didn't. Power is like water. It always finds a way back in, even if it has to flow uphill, even if it's missing some essential equipment. Before their spectacular fall, before the fire and the blood and the extremely thorough genital inspections, the eunuchs had built something remarkable. Not just a power structure or a shadow government, but a fully functioning criminal empire that would have made the Medici jealous and the Mafia take notes. At the heart of this testicular-free crime syndicate sat the 10 attendants, a cabal of ultra-rich eunuchs who had essentially turned the entire Han Empire into their personal ATM, if ATMs also murdered your enemies and wrote poetry about it. The 10 attendants weren't just powerful, they were obscenely, grotesquely, buy a province for fun wealthy. They controlled the salt monopoly, which in ancient China was like controlling oil, water, and the internet simultaneously. They managed the iron trade, ensuring that every sword, every plough, every cooking pot in the empire generated profit for their silk-lined pockets. They owned the Silk Road, or at least the parts of it that mattered, taking a cut from every merchant who wanted to transport goods without mysteriously disappearing in the desert. Leading this castrated crime family was Zhang Rang, a man who had transformed his missing balls into balls of steel, metaphorically speaking. His personal wealth reportedly exceeded the imperial treasury, which wasn't surprising, since he controlled what went into the treasury, what came out of it, and what accidentally fell off the wagon in between. His accounting methods were creative in ways that would make modern hedge fund managers weep with envy. Revenue disappeared, reappeared, multiplied and divided according to rules that only Zhang understood and changed whenever convenient. Zhang's mansion in Luoyang was less a home and more a statement of intent. The statement was, "I have all the money and you don't." Gold-leafed walls reflected the light from pearl-encrusted ceilings. The furniture was made from woods so rare that some of the trees were extinct. His gardens featured plants from every corner of the empire, tended by gardeners who were paid more than provincial governors. He kept a private zoo with animals that included tigers, peacocks, and the occasional disgraced official who'd annoyed him. The tigers were fed better, but Zhang was just the first among equals in this syndicate of the surgically altered. Each of the 10 attendants had carved out their own criminal speciality, turning the empire into a perfectly organized kleptocracy. Zhao Zhang controlled the eastern provinces like a feudal lord, except with better clothes and worse morals. His territory included the richest agricultural lands and the busiest ports, and he made sure that every grain of rice, every bolt of silk, every imported curiosity paid tribute to his personal coffers. The protection rackets they ran would have impressed a Chicago bootlegger. Want to transport grain from point A to point B? You needed a license. Want a license? You needed approval. Want approval? You needed to make a generous donation to the Eunuch Benevolent Association, which was about as benevolent as a hungry shark. The donation rates were posted publicly, right next to the execution notices for merchants who tried to circumvent the system. It was transparently corrupt, which was almost refreshing in its honesty. They even developed a sliding scale of bribes, posted like a restaurant menu. Avoiding a tax audit? 500 gold pieces. Getting your rival audited? 750. Having your rival's audit find irregularities? 1,000, plus a performance bonus if he was executed. Getting your rival executed while you married his widow and inherited his business? Now that was premium service, requiring negotiation and possibly your firstborn daughter for the imperial harem. One of the most innovative attendants was Duan Gui, who specialized in judicial corruption with the dedication of a master craftsman. He kept a comprehensive ledger of every judge in the empire, noting their price, their preferences, their weaknesses, and their favorite types of bribes. Some preferred gold, others land, and a few peculiar ones wanted rare books or exotic birds. Yuan catered to all tastes. Need a guilty verdict despite your obvious innocence? Duan could arrange it. Need an innocent verdict despite overwhelming evidence of your guilt, including signed confessions and multiple witnesses? That cost extra, but Duan delivered, with a smile and a receipt. The most audacious of the 10 was Hulan, who had decided that just because he couldn't use a harem didn't mean he couldn't have one. He collected concubines like some people collect stamps, except stamps don't require food, clothing, and jewelry. His wives, and he insisted on calling them that, were the most beautiful women in the empire, purchased or kidnapped from noble families who suddenly discovered their daughters had volunteered for palace service. He couldn't do anything with them, of course, but possession is 9/10 of perversion. He dressed them in the finest silks, taught them to play instruments, and held elaborate parties where everyone pretended this wasn't deeply, profoundly weird. The parties themselves were legendary displays of excess that would have made Caligula blush and Nero take notes. The 10 attendants would rent entire districts of the capital, closing them to regular traffic so their guests wouldn't have to see poor people. They imported musicians from across the empire, dancers from beyond the borders, and chefs who could turn simple ingredients into complex poisons or elaborate feasts, depending on the guest list. The entertainment included poetry readings, mostly praising eunuchs or subtly threatening their enemies, acrobatic performances, often involving creative use of sharp objects, and drinking games where the stakes were usually someone's career, property, or life. At one memorable banquet, Shang Rang served a dish made from the tongues of 1,000 songbirds. The message was clear. We can silence anything, even nature itself. The guests got the point. They also got indigestion, but complaining about the food would have been both rude and potentially fatal. Another feast featured a wine made from grapes grown in the gardens of officials who had disappointed the eunuchs. Each sip tasted of someone else's misfortune, which apparently paired well with fish. The 10 attendants didn't just take bribes, they innovated in the field of corruption. They created what modern economists might recognize as derivatives markets in government positions. Young men from wealthy families could buy options on future appointments, paying annually for the promise of a position when one became available. If the young man died, fell into disgrace, or simply annoyed a eunuch before his appointment, the attendants kept all the money. If a better offer came along, they kept the money and sold the position to someone else. It was brilliant, ruthless, and completely legal, because the eunuchs wrote the laws. They also pioneered vertical integration in corruption. They didn't just take bribes from merchants, they became merchants. They owned the companies that got government contracts, controlled the banks that loaned money to desperate officials, and ran the brothels where those officials revealed state secrets, along with their clothes. It was a closed loop of corruption where every transaction generated profit for the attendants at multiple points. They were simultaneously the house, the dealer, and the only ones who knew what cards were in the deck. Their intelligence network was the NSA of ancient China, if the NSA was run by castrated criminals with unlimited budgets and no oversight. Every servant in every noble house was potentially on their payroll. Every guard might be filing reports. Every concubine could be persuaded to share more than just her bed. They knew which general's son had gambling debts, which minister's wife was having an affair with her music teacher, which scholar was writing seditious poetry in his spare time. Information was catalogued, cross-referenced and weaponized with the efficiency of a modern database. The physical infrastructure of their crime empire was equally impressive. They built a network of safe houses throughout the capital, where sensitive negotiations could take place, rivals could be tortured, and evidence could be destroyed. These houses were connected by tunnels, actual physical tunnels, that allowed eunuchs to move throughout the city without being seen. Some historians suggest that there were more eunuchs below ground than above it, scurrying through the darkness like extremely well-dressed moles. They even had their own private armies, because what's the point of being a crime lord without muscle? Officially, these were household guards protecting their mansions. Unofficially, they were better trained and equipped than many imperial units. The attendants recruited former soldiers, barbarian mercenaries, and anyone else who valued gold over ethics. They trained them in palace warfare, which was like regular warfare but with more poison and better outfits. These private armies numbered in the thousands, stationed throughout the capital in compounds that looked like mansions but functioned like fortresses. The financial schemes they developed would make modern pyramid schemes look like honest business. They manipulated grain prices by controlling storage, creating artificial shortages when they wanted prices high, and flooding the market when they'd cornered it. They ran the ancient equivalent of insider trading, using their advanced knowledge of imperial policies to make strategic investments. When the emperor was about to ban silk exports, the eunuchs had already stockpiled silk. When a new tax on salt was coming, they'd already bought up the salt mines. One particularly clever scheme involved the currency itself. The attendants convinced the emperor to issue new coins to celebrate his glorious reign. What they didn't mention was that they controlled the mints and were producing two versions of each coin, one for the treasury and one for themselves. The forgeries were so good that they became the standard, while the real coins were considered suspicious. They had literally counterfeited reality and made it legal. But perhaps their greatest innovation was the industrialization of blackmail. Every transaction, every bribe, every favor was meticulously documented in archives that would make the Stasi jealous. They employed armies of scribes who did nothing but copy and cross-section dirt on everyone important in the empire. These archives were distributed across multiple locations to prevent any single fire or raid from destroying them. Some were hidden in temples, some in merchants' warehouses, some allegedly buried in the tombs of previous eunuchs guarded by the dead. The blackmail itself was an art form. The attendants never simply threatened. That was crude. Instead, they would invite their target for tea and casually mention how unfortunate it was about Minister so-and-so's recent execution for corruption. Then they'd pause, sip their tea, and wonder aloud whether the target's own financial records were in order. Another sip. Had they heard about the new anti-corruption campaign? So vigorous, so thorough. Would they like more tea? The corruption became so systematic that honesty was actually suspicious. Officials who refused bribes were investigated for hidden income. Judges who ruled fairly were assumed to be playing a longer game. Generals who won battles without paying off eunuchs were clearly planning rebellion. The attendants had created a world where corruption wasn't just normal, but necessary for survival. They even corrupted language itself. Official documents developed a coded vocabulary that everyone understood but no one acknowledged. The matter requires further consideration meant you haven't paid enough. His Majesty's concerned meant pay immediately or face consequences. The eunuchs have noted your loyalty meant you're dead unless you double your bribe. Your service has been exemplary meant we own you now. It was poetry, where every verse was a threat and every compliment came with a price tag. The 10 attendants competed among themselves in displays of wealth that bordered on parody. Zhang Rang built a bed made entirely of gold, which was hideously uncomfortable but made a statement. Zhao Zhong constructed a bathroom where the toilet was carved from a single piece of jade because nothing says power like making people think about where you defecate. Duang Gui commissioned a sedan chair that required 50 men to carry, not because he was heavy but because he could afford 50 men. Their tombs, constructed while they were still alive, because why wait, were monuments to excess. Larger than some palaces, filled with more treasure than provincial treasuries, they were designed to ensure that the attendants would be richer than everyone else, even in death. The tomb complexes included quarters for servants who would be killed and buried with them, stables for horses, also to be killed, and reception halls for entertaining guests in the afterlife. The guests, mercifully, were allowed to die naturally. But the real crime wasn't the wealth they accumulated, it was what they did to accumulate it. The tax burden on peasants increased every year, with the extra revenue disappearing into eunuch pockets. Public works projects were approved, funded, and then abandoned after the funds vanished. Military supplies were sold to the highest bidder, including enemies of the state. Famine relief grain was exported for profit while people starved. The empire was being hollowed out from the inside, carved up and sold piece by men who couldn't father children, but had no problem destroying everyone else's. The 10 attendants' influence extended beyond China's borders. They had agents in foreign courts, spreading gold and gathering intelligence. They manipulated trade agreements to favor their personal businesses. They started border conflicts when it suited their interests, and ended them when the profit margins dropped. At one point, they allegedly sold the same trade route rights to 3 different kingdoms simultaneously, then let them fight over it while selling weapons to all sides. In their final years, the paranoia crept in like fog. Success breeds enemies, and the attendants had been very successful. They tested their food with multiple tasters, slept in different rooms each night, and never traveled by the same route twice. They built escape tunnels under their mansions, maintained boats ready to flee at a moment's notice, and kept substantial funds in foreign banks or the ancient equivalent. They trusted no one, not even each other, especially not each other. The meetings of the 10 attendants became tense affairs where everyone smiled while calculating murder. They would toast each other's health with wine they'd watched each other pour, eat from communal dishes to prevent targeted poisoning, and compliment each other's schemes while planning to steal them. It was exhausting being that professionally paranoid. By 189 CE, they had created something unprecedented, a criminal organization that had completely replaced legitimate government. They weren't hiding in the shadows, they were the shadows. They didn't corrupt the system, they were the system. Every judge, every tax collector, every military commander either worked for them or worked in fear of them. The end, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. All that accumulated wealth, all those carefully cultivated networks, all those private armies, none of it mattered when the real soldiers came calling. The 10 attendants discovered that you can't bribe your way out of a sword to the neck, though several tried. Their guards, those well-paid mercenaries, took one look at the approaching imperial armies and remembered urgent appointments elsewhere. Zhan Rang died, clutching a manifest of his wealth, as if the paper could shield him from steel. Zhao Zhong was found in his jade bathroom, hiding in his priceless toilet. Yuan Gui tried to escape in his 50-man sedan chair, but discovered that 50 men move slowly when being chased by cavalry. Ulan's harem scattered like birds, finally free from their gilded cage. But their legacy lived on, in the corruption they'd embedded so deeply in Chinese government that it would take dynasties to root out. They'd shown that with enough creativity, even men without balls could fuck an entire empire. They'd proven that in the right circumstances, physical powerlessness could be transformed into political omnipotence. The jars containing their preserved genitals were found in their mansions, some in elaborate shrines, others forgotten in storerooms. The soldiers, with rough humor, suggested reuniting the attendants with their missing parts in death. But in the end, the jars were just thrown away with the rest of the garbage. Because that's what the 10 attendants had become, garbage to be disposed of, their criminal empire dismantled, their names becoming synonymous with corruption so complete it had its own poetry. They had been kings without crowns, rulers without thrones, men without manhood, who had somehow managed to castrate an entire civilization. And they had loved every minute of it. The finale arrived with the subtlety of a thunderclap in a library. After decades of shadow rule, after turning the empire into their personal playground, after proving that you could indeed run a civilization without testicles, the eunuchs were about to discover the iron law of Chinese politics. What goes up must come down, usually accompanied by arterial spray. The year 189 CE was drawing to a close, and with it, the Han Dynasty's experiment in government by castration. The capital still smouldered from the various fires, some set by eunuchs, some by their enemies, and some by people who just enjoyed a good fire. The air tasted of endings, burning silk, spilled blood, and the distinctive aroma of a dynasty discovering it was mortal after all. The man who lit the final match was Dong Zhuo, a general who approached subtlety the way an avalanche approaches a ski lodge. He arrived at the capital with his army, took one look at the chaos, the boy emperor, the squabbling warlords, the eunuchs still trying to manipulate everyone, and decided the solution was more chaos. But his chaos, organized chaos, chaos with a 5-year plan. Dong Zhuo was what historians politely call a man of appetites, and what everyone else called a monster with pretensions. He weighed as much as 3 normal men, had the table manners of a barbarian, which he technically was, and possessed the kind of ambition that looked at the burning capital and saw opportunity. While others were fighting over who controlled the emperor, Dong Zhuo asked the more pertinent question, why not just control everyone? The remaining eunuchs, those who'd survived the initial purges by hiding, fleeing, or being very, very quiet, tried their old tricks one last time. They sent messages to Dong Zhuo, offering bribes that would have bought kingdoms. These messages typically began with the kind of flowery language that made even simple greetings sound like poetry. We understand you appreciate the finer things in life. We happen to have all of them. Perhaps we could reach an understanding. Dong Zhuo's response was to use their messages as kindling for his evening fire. He wasn't interested in their gold, he was planning to take it anyway. He wasn't interested in their intelligence networks, he had his own spies. He wasn't interested in their offers of power, he already had an army. What's the point of negotiating when you can simply eliminate? The hunt for the remaining eunuchs became methodical, in a way that only military minds could achieve. Dong Zhuo's soldiers went door to door with the kind of thorough dedication usually reserved for tax collection. They checked every male servant, investigated every high-pitched voice, and developed a disturbingly efficient system for anatomical verification. The identification process was humiliatingly simple. Drop your pants or lose your head. Many chose to loose their heads, which at least preserved some dignity. Some eunuchs tried fleeing to the countryside, forgetting that decades of palace luxury had left them uniquely unsuited for rough living. They stood out like peacocks among chickens, soft hands that had never held anything heavier than a brush, refined accents that pronounced rural dialects like foreign languages, and a complete inability to perform basic farm labor without composing complaints in classical verse. Peasants who had suffered under eunuch tax policies for generations were remarkably eager to point them out to searching soldiers. In one darkly comic incident that would have been hilarious if it weren't so fatal, a group of eunuchs tried to disguise themselves as a travelling opera troupe. They made it 3 villages before someone noticed that all the actresses had Adam's apples and surprisingly deep voices. The performance review was brief and involved swords. The audience, mostly peasants who'd never seen either opera or executions performed with such professionalism, gave mixed reviews. The smart eunuchs, and there were precious few of those left, had seen this coming years ago. They'd quietly transferred wealth to foreign banks, arranged new identities, and slipped away before the purge began. They vanished into history, presumably living out their days as mysteriously wealthy merchants with peculiarly high voices and an unusual knowledge of court etiquette. Some allegedly made it to Korea, others to the southern kingdoms, and a few supposedly reached the western regions, where their inability to reproduce was less of a conversation starter. But for every smart eunuch, there were dozens who'd grown too comfortable, too confident, too convinced of their own invincibility. Zhang Rang, the chief architect of eunuch power, the shadow emperor who'd ruled through 3 actual emperors, faced his end at the Yellow River. Pursued by soldiers who really wanted to discuss his recent policy decisions with sharp objects, he stood at the muddy bank contemplating his options. Behind him, soldiers with swords and very specific instructions about what to do with them. Before him, the Yellow River, murky and indifferent, flowing toward the sea with the same disregard for human ambition it had shown for 5,000 years. Zhang Rang, who'd spent his life calculating odds and manipulating outcomes, made his final calculation. He jumped, or was pushed. Accounts vary depending on how much the historian enjoyed dramatic irony. His body was recovered downstream 3 days later, still clutching a jade seal of office, his fingers locked around it with the determination of a man who couldn't let go of power, even in death. The seal was prized from his fingers and melted down, the gold used to pay the soldiers who'd killed him. It was efficient recycling with a message: your symbols of power will become our drinking money. Other members of the 10 attendants met equally poetic ends. Zhao Zhong was found hiding in a grain silo, suffocated by the wealth he'd hoarded, literally drowning in grain while the empire starved. Duan Gui was betrayed by one of his own protégés, a younger eunuch who'd calculated that selling out his master might buy him a few more days of life. It didn't, but the betrayal was appreciated with a slightly quicker death. Ulan and his peculiar harem were discovered in a monastery where they'd been pretending to be very dedicated nuns. The disguise might have worked if they hadn't insisted on maintaining court protocol even while chanting sutras. Bowing to Buddha is one thing, bowing to Buddha with the 37 different gradations of respect used in the imperial palace is quite another. The soldiers were almost impressed by their dedication to etiquette before killing them. The palace itself was purged room by room, with the thoroughness of spring cleaning if spring cleaning involved swords. Hidden compartments were broken open, revealing treasures that could have funded armies. Secret passages were explored, uncovering everything from torture chambers to libraries of blackmail material. The eunuchs were discovered in increasingly creative hiding spots. Inside giant vases, behind false walls, under floorboards, and in one memorable case, inside a statue of Confucius, which scholars found both ironic and offensive. One eunuch was found in a wardrobe where he'd been hiding for so long he'd forgotten what he was hiding from. When soldiers opened the door, he simply asked if it was time for the evening meal. The soldiers, showing unusual mercy, told him yes and gave him his last meal before his last breath. It was the kindest death any eunuch received that week. The eunuch archives proved to be a treasure trove of a different sort. Decades of meticulously recorded corruption, every bribe documented, every conspiracy catalogued, every embarrassing secret indexed with the kind of attention to detail that only the deeply paranoid can achieve. The soldiers who found them spent days reading, occasionally exclaiming things like, "So that's why Minister Wang retired suddenly," or "I knew General Li couldn't afford that mansion honestly," or "Wait, the Emperor did what with a donkey?" In a final irony, the documents were too valuable to destroy. The new regime needed them to understand the labyrinthine corruption of the old system. They needed to know who owed what to whom, which officials were compromised, which generals were bought. The eunuch's greatest weapon, information, became their monument, proof of how thoroughly they'd corrupted everything they touched. The provincial purges were less dramatic, but more thorough. Local governors used the anti-eunuch campaign as cover for all sorts of score settling. The definition of eunuch collaborator expanded to include anyone with property worth confiscating, anyone who'd ever annoyed the governor, and anyone who couldn't prove they weren't a eunuch sympathizer, which was everyone, since proving a negative is philosophically impossible. Some eunuchs tried to organize resistance in the outer provinces, forming small bands of the testicularly challenged who dreamed of restoration. They sent coded messages to each other, planned counterattacks, and generally acted like a government in exile if the government was run by sopranos. These resistance movements lasted exactly as long as it took for local armies to find them, which wasn't long, since it's hard to organize a secret rebellion when your high-pitched voices carry across valleys. The Emperor Xian, now pushing 10 years old and developing the kind of cynicism usually reserved for much older politicians, watched it all with the detachment of someone who'd learned that his opinion mattered less than his seal. He signed execution orders with the same enthusiasm he'd once shown for signing his calligraphy practice. If he felt any nostalgia for the eunuchs who'd raised him, who'd fed him candy and told him he was divine, he kept it to himself. Expressing sympathy for eunuchs had recently become fatal. As the blood dried and the ashes settled, China took stock of what remained. The eunuch system, built over centuries, refined through dynasties, perfected under the Han, had collapsed in less than a year. The castrated men who'd once controlled the empire were dead, fled, or hiding so well they'd forgotten who they were hiding from. Their mansions were looted, their networks dismantled, their jars of preserved genitals thrown out with the rest of the garbage. But nature, as mentioned repeatedly throughout this saga, abhors a vacuum. The warlords, who'd destroyed the eunuchs, immediately began fighting each other for control of the emperor and, by extension, the empire. Dangerois, fresh from his eunuch hunting success, decided he quite liked the idea of controlling the emperor. He just planned to do it with soldiers instead of scissors, with might instead of mutilation. The empire fractured into what historians call the Three Kingdoms period, though at the time it was more like the everyone with an army thinks they're a kingdom period. In a way, the eunuchs had won a posthumous victory. They'd so thoroughly destabilized the government that it couldn't function without them, couldn't function with them, and ultimately couldn't function at all. Yet the idea of eunuchs didn't die with the Han Dynasty. Future dynasties would resurrect the practice, apparently having learned nothing from history except that history has a sense of humor. The Tang would have their eunuch dramas, the Ming would perfect eunuch admirals, and the Qing would end with a eunuch trying to restore the monarchy. Because if there's one thing Chinese emperors loved more than absolute power, it was surrounding themselves with men who'd sacrificed their futures for a chance to control the present. As the last eunuch body was dumped in an unmarked grave, as the final mansion was stripped of its gold, as the emperor signed yet another document he didn't understand, the Han Dynasty's great experiment in genital-free governance came to its messy, blood-soaked end. The men who traded their manhood for power discovered that power without swords is just expensive impotence. The empire learned that corruption, like water, finds its own level, regardless of the plumbing. And somewhere in the ruins of the palace, in forgotten storerooms and abandoned chambers, those jars of pickled genitals gathered dust, monuments to ambition preserved in brine. The eunuchs were gone. The empire stumbled on, wounded and divided. And in the distance, the Yellow River flowed indifferently toward the sea, carrying with it the last traces of the men who'd ruled China from behind silk curtains, with high-pitched voices and low intentions. How strange that the men with no sons ended up fathering an entire style of empire, an empire of whispers and bribes, of soft power and hard choices, of influence without inheritance. They'd built a government that couldn't outlive them, and perhaps that was their greatest joke of all. The knife that made emperors had finally cut too deep. The system that created perfect servants had created perfect monsters. And in the end, everyone paid the price. Everyone except the eunuchs. They'd already paid theirs, up front, in a jar. Sleep well, and dream of empires that rise and fall on the edge of a blade. Dream of power that costs everything and guarantees nothing. Dream of men who gave up tomorrow for today, and discovered that today is a very temporary position. Dream of the price of ambition, paid in flesh and collected in blood. The eunuchs are gone, but somewhere in the darkness, if you listen carefully, you can still hear the echo of their footsteps. Soft shoes on marble floors, carrying secrets that toppled dynasties and poisons that tasted like loyalty. History remembers them as a cautionary tale. They probably would have preferred cash. Good night.